Hello everyone and welcome to episode 35 of UK League Chat. This time we're joined by Veteran. Veteran, how's it going?
Going good, going good. Happy to be here.
Good stuff, good to have you. Um, Going generally good for us as well, but would be better if, like Tom said just before we started, the Riddle result had gone slightly differently, but we'll get on to
Sure.
that. So just before we go on to EU Masters, which is obviously the kind of main subject of the episode, when we have someone new, we do usually do like a bit of an interview, just kind of work out, what they're up to and what's going on there. So yeah, we'll start with that, just a bit on what you've been up to recently, because you're obviously someone that was mainly coaching
Sure.
before, but then you've kind of branched out. It seems more recently. So what is your kind of focus at the moment? Is it more just sort of the streaming? I know you're doing co-streams and stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. So for the last couple of years, I've mostly been doing content, mostly through streaming, as you said. I also do a lot of solo queue coaching on my Discord. But majority of what I've been trying to do is trying to focus on helping the narrative shift as close towards you being a strong rock bed of rookie talent as possible. So for that, EU Masters has been like a big deal for me. I even was on the analyst desk for EU Masters last year, for example,
Hmm.
before Riot took it over, and and for me, the big strength of any region has to be from its native talent pool, because you're only going to be as strong as the server in which everyone is commonly practicing on, right? So this is a massive issue North America has right now, is that they don't have a hotbed of talent by default on the North American server, and as a result, it's very difficult for them to create a strong practice environment for any of the imports that they bring in,
Hmm.
right? Which is why North America is essentially a retirement home right now. And the reasoning behind that is that, and if you talk to these North American players, you'll find out they are very aware that they are placeholders for when the orgs bring in an import. And why do orgs do that? Because the market dictates that everyone prefers a European player or a Korean player, and blah blah blah. Which is why people like Huni can get held on like $1 million contracts, because you can use them to sell ad space to sponsors, etc., which is how you make all of your money, right? The vast majority of money made in esports is through sponsorships and advertising. um so I focus very heavily in the last few years on trying to shift the narrative and thus shift the market demands as close towards rookie talent rather than veteran talent, despite my name, as possible. Because that's the only way really to convince organizations that's where the money is by literally creating market forces that
Hmm.
cause them to have to react to that, right? And luckily, then teams like Origin came in along and helped as well by completely collapsing, and teams like Mad Lions came in, taking
Yeah.
basically all the best rookie talents that they could, and doing really, really well with them. Rogue literally took their entire academy team and then just replaced Woolite with Hans Sammer, which is a thumbs up, and did really, really well with them. Right, like there are a lot of examples in Europe now of all of this, but you had to be able to like capitalize on it even when these examples occur. These examples weren't always occurring, or in Europe's case, actually, every single year we always had a rookie team going to the World
Hmm.
Championships. They generally did poorly in spring, but they would always go to the World Championships every year, except for last year when franchising was put in play. Every year they would end up making it in. And despite that narrative, every single year you see the MVP votes don't predominantly go to rookies. You see ex-rookie team doing well being, oh, a massive surprise. A lot of people underrating Mad Lions coming in, not me, but a lot of people underrating Mad Lions coming in, for example. Like every year it still is a surprise. The narrative is still shifting further and further towards rookies. So it's not all the way there, but this is the only real counterbalance that you can have. So I've been focusing on that a lot for the last few years. Though right now I can't actually stream. My internet's not really that good. So going on shows like you is like the best way for me to actually start streaming again. Yeah, it's a whole palaver right now. I have a 90 set of chess moves to get guaranteed good internet for the next few months, all right? But I'm not going to say what it is, because if it fails, people will be like, "What did you do that for?" But if it works, it's going to be really cool. So we'll
Yeah,
see. We'll
I
see.
I know the struggle. I had well, a bit off topic, but yeah, my girlfriend and I stayed in a flat for a year where we couldn't get actual internet. We were tethering from our phones for a whole year,
Oof.
and
Oh,
yeah, not not ideal.
I had to do that in London. I had to do that in London,
Yeah,
tether from my phone.
outrageous.
And every Elites United episode from will be like, can't you like fix your camera and blah blah. It's like, okay, all the setup's the same, all right. I'm just literally doing this off a dongle, okay? It's really difficult.
I think one point which you did bring up was like EU Masters as a whole. Do you think that then kind of creating that narrative, I feel like every year there's more and more emphasis being put onto EU Masters. I think especially considering like from the Riot side of kind of doing the this split as well, they did that the EU Masters highlight. There's still like content where they, at least at the pre-show, they kind of provided some opinions and there's some kind of narratives going in. And I do feel like viewership kind of goes up and up. Now, play-ins was a bit of a mess, but hopefully then in like the main event, it kind of sorts out. Now we're getting an English broadcast and stuff like that.
Like, that's the counterbalance, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the counter argument, I mean, right? Like,
Yeah.
like play-ins was previously fully broadcasted when it was under ESL, but Riot have the habit of wanting to control literally every single aspect of the scene, and the EU Masters, the ERL scene. Yeah, you probably shouldn't have put me on this show if you want to get jobs in the ERL scene was effectively a massive blind spot that Riot missed. And it came up in spite of Riot, because all Riot had to sell was one big homogenous English language broadcast. However, if you are an advertising company, or I mean, you are a company that wants advertising in a specific region within Europe, Riot can't help you with that. But the Spanish League can help you with that, for example. So you have teams in the Spanish League who were sponsored by big organizations like Burger King, for example, right? Like, these guys were pulling in the sponsors that Riot could only dream of, but it's because these guys wanted to specifically target their advertising towards region-based areas. And these guys abused the fact that Riot was not doing multi-language broadcasts, was not doing multi-language region-specific leads, and they capitalized on that. The ERLs were essentially a massive blind spot for Riot in that sense. Since Riot have taken control of the regional leagues, we've seen two major developments. One is the EU Masters tournament, which I'm fully in favor of. I think that's a brilliant deal. But second, after they then took full control of EU Masters, because it's outsourced to ESL beforehand, it has now downscaled massively. And maybe you can put some of that towards COVID, but that's because the resources are still going elsewhere anyway. We wouldn't have gotten a play-ins even if it was at LANs in all likelihood, right? We likely wouldn't have got, or not at LANs, but even if it was all held in studio in pre-COVID times, we very likely probably wouldn't have gotten that either. And we've also seen the regional aspects of, for example, the UK League and the Danish leagues kind of being thrown out the window in favor of NLC. But that makes sense, because the UK League was famously not doing very well anyway, because unlike the Spanish League, the French League, the German League, etc., it couldn't just be like, oh, now you have an English language broadcast. Oh, wow, brilliant. The first time we've ever had an English language League of Legends broadcast, right? Oh, and all the teams are dog shit. So it ends up being like 100 to 200 viewer stream for ages. You guys remember how it was initially? It was legit, like the finals get like 180 viewers. It was insane, actually, how low viewership it was. And once you get over towards the Nordics, Counter-Strike is the dominant force there. If you are getting into esports, why would you get into League of Legends in Denmark? As an advertiser, you wouldn't. So despite the fact that we get like a lot of Danish players or Swedish players, for example, in League of Legends, the community, the audience there doesn't quite exist. So the NLC is actually a really good compromise that I actually do support. But on the EU Masters side of things, I think with Riot's involvement, we've actually seen like a decrease in how much priority we end up putting on the EU Masters broadcast itself. However, the reality of the situation is, for these rookie players, that while they are getting good exposure to the public, generally speaking, organizations only really focus on the last four members of the EU Masters, right? Like, it's very rare that coaches will have watched more than that. It's very rare players will have watched these at all, but it's not really their job to, but we still kind of devolve to players a lot anyway. So despite the fact that Riot isn't really focusing on play-ins, etc., it makes sense from a marketing perspective, because most people do just focus on the final four teams, regardless, audience included, and there isn't really much money in the play-ins. So then it becomes the job of people like us to try to shift the narrative towards all the other teams as well. And that's always going to be the tug of war, right? Because if we can shift the narrative towards favoring them, we can shift market forces towards being in a state where Riot are like, you know what, maybe we shouldn't ignore the play-ins, and then things can go really well for the rookies in the play-ins. But there is no monetary incentive for them to do anything like play-ins right now, and more or less they just want full control of their IP is why they're involved in the ERLs at all. They just missed this, other people came in, so now Riot come in and are like, all right, okay, you know what, we are actually in on all this now. fuck it, let's do this. But they're in it because they want the sponsors everyone else got that Riot missed in the first place.
And I think you're completely correct, especially when you mentioned like the SLO in the Spanish scene, because the Spanish scene is its own ecosystem where you can create a good brand, a solid brand, and maybe not be like very have like a great revenue stream, but a revenue stream nevertheless. You know, I believe G2 Arctic have Chips Ahoy, you know, and that there's other kind of Spanish brands which are also linked with the Spanish media. So, yes, that's what I mean. So it kind of shows that there is like there is kind of an ecosystem which you can create, a sustainable ecosystem you can create, which isn't just LEC. And I do believe that then kind of Riot has seen that and then thought, well, okay, well, our priority was the LEC. Let's try and work our way down and things like that. Obviously, we don't know about the relationship between LVP and Riot, obviously with what happened with the UK scene and stuff like that. But like, that's a different thing. But you kind of hope that when they did it, when they've had this relationship with DreamHack, that kind of will help the UK scene. You are correct though about the Nordics. It's CS:GO. It's so heavily CS:GO and those type of games that you even look at like the sides which came into the NLC. It's Ents and Godsend who are primarily CS:GO kind of those style sides that is a branding opportunity for them to hopefully reach into it. Vice versa, it's great for the NLC because then you're getting these two popular sides in Denmark also going in, and so hopefully that can build the league up as a whole because it is all about kind of having the right teams and then also having the right ecosystem around it.
I enjoyed working with DreamHack. I didn't hear very good things about LVP UK, but I never personally worked with them. But I had I had a good time working with DreamHack. They treated me very well, and I had a really good time working with ESL as well. I will probably never be able to tell you what it's like working with Riot, but you know what? Maybe we'll see one day.
Just while we're on the topic of the NLC, then you mentioned about it could be difficult for Riot to pull in sponsors and stuff, and we've talked before as well how the viewership hasn't probably been quite where they'd want it with the merger going on. What do you see that they could do to maybe push it that bit further? Because from my perspective, I see that I think the general level of play has actually gone up quite a lot. Obviously, the player pool is much better than it was in the UKLC or in just Nordic Championship. Do you think that's enough that just that will people will take notice? Because it looks like what could have helped, obviously, with that better player pool, we've got better teams, would maybe be a couple of decent EU Masters runs for people to take notice, but we kind of obviously Riddle have meant that there's only a chance of one anyway, and it will just be Fnatic again, who have obviously reached the semi-final a few times, and that obviously hasn't made that much difference. So what do you see they could do to maybe push it a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, like, results aren't really the thing that allows leagues to be popular anyway. That's never been the case. These leagues existed long before EU Masters was ever a thing again, right? Like, these things existed because there was a pre-existing community there. So the Spanish and the German scene exist because there was a massive market there that Riot never exploited. So a private company came in and was like, you know what, we're gonna, as opposed to a public company. Well, it came in and was like, you know what, we'll take all the sponsors and the money and we'll do our own broadcast and we'll do it my own way of blackjack and hookers. And Riot came in and was like, okay, screw the blackjack and the hookers, blah blah blah. The thing that unites all of these guys though is that the big popularity areas were twofold. Either they were with national players that they could identify with in a way that they can't with a lot of the LEC players, majority because they speak their own language and come from their own country, right? So D'Antonio is absolutely massive despite playing only 2 champions competently, right? No Way is massive as well, and for some weird reason this competitive team actually did really fucking well for some reason that is legendary now. But the thing that a lot of people miss is that the broadcast talent all massively benefited from this because they became the things that if you weren't following the players, you were definitely tuning in for the broadcast talent themselves. So Summoners In is a massive example of this, right? Summoners In is almost entirely based around what the LEC are doing right now, but on crack cocaine. Right, like what the LEC doing right now pales in comparison to what Summoners In was doing back in the day. They had their own fake documentary about their own fake professional team, right? Spandau Inferno. You were following this shit as a German because you identified with these Germans. You obviously felt more comfortable watching them than watching some random English fart who barely understands the game anyway. What the fuck are you getting from this? And they were doing comedy. They were doing skits. They were doing drama. They were doing consistent stuff though, right? Not your average rap battle or something. There were consistent shows that they were doing with loads of continuity that they would even reference on broadcast and stuff, right? And the Spanish scene ended up having its own identity with its own casting team as well. What Riot have done, we can talk about the French scene later because I hate what happened to the French scene.
Yeah, that's bad. That's bad.
What DreamHack have gone for, I should say, not what Riot have done. What DreamHack have gone for is trying to get an initial viewer boost by grabbing on like popular casters from the Riot broadcast and me, and this can work for the initial viewer boost, but you need to give them a reason to stay. And the flip side, by having these people on rotation, is that they haven't allowed their casting team to create that kind of an identity as well. I think if you give people a reason to come onto NLC, it's going to come from caster content, from making them not just like a family internally, but from making them a sort of continuity that people want to come in and follow. Because there's no way, like you can put it like any way you want. There's no way that you're going to be able to get people to tune in to watch Moomoo's play, as much as I love the guy, right? You're not going to be able to get them to come in to watch him over watching, say, Tolkien plays, getting a lot of hype right now, or Sleeping play, or any of these guys play, right? There's no way you're going to be able to beat these other leagues on an individual player level and use them to get people in. But maybe you can beat their content. And the content is where all of these leagues have created their following from, that the NLC actually has a window to do so in. But by doing these rotations that they did, whereas they may get an initial viewer surge, they haven't allowed their own internal casting team that they're going to use week in, week out from creating that identity. The LEC has begun doing that identity for themselves in the last year, and it's been incredibly successful. Everyone loves the LEC casters. People will tune in for the LEC content as much as they'll tune in for fucking Jack Troll, right? Like this is the area I think the NLC needs to focus on if it wants to create viewership. And they haven't started yet because of the aforementioned delays by getting all of the popular people rotating on. But if next year they focus on that, maybe they can create an identity, or even in the off season, because in the off season you can do a bunch of content with the casting team, right? That has nothing to do with them. You can do your own kind of Spandau Inferno thing. Don't just directly nick the idea, guys, but think of your own thing, right? Like I remember a really cool Polish thing that I could never understand the word of because I don't speak a word of Polish, one of the hardest fucking languages I'll ever try to learn, I swear to God. Where they had their own like team, but they would get like coaches like Veggie and stuff to come in and like coach them on stream and stuff, and you could as a viewer like win the opportunity to come into their gaming house and beat one of their players, and you'd be like on the show and shit like this, you know. People are doing this kind of content outside of the NLC. The NLC is just a worse version of the LEC right now, which makes it an astronomically worse version of all the ERL broadcasts, you know. At least start trying. And that's the area where you can get viewers that doesn't rely on you having an identity that the LEC has already cultured in terms of, you know, oh, we speak English. There you go. Brilliant. Because that's literally what everyone else has the advantage on. They have that advantage. Just do content, guys. That's what I think they have to do.
I do think that there was a couple of videos which they did, and I think one was Taiki talking about how he was going into football, and then and it was like a proper like sit down interview, and I thought that was really good because I never knew anything about Taiki, and then even though like I don't tune in to kind of see his play, like his story of kind of being, you know, going to be a footballer and then decided to choose league. That's good content. And I know they did one with Trouble Inc. as well. The problem is they didn't do enough. It was kind of very much like they had that Taiki one and then they didn't do anything for about 4 weeks. And then they had the Trouble Inc. one. And so it's kind of like you need that consistency. If you're going to do these kind of packages, you want one every week at least, I think. You know, and I think that's where it needs to come in.
But the Taiki thing would be really good if you like already had viewership, right? Then you are promoting Taiki to that viewership. But interviewing Taiki, similar with Moomoo's, you're not going to be able to convince anyone to watch NLC on the basis of Taiki versus, you know, a bunch of, no offense, like really actually good players on the other leagues, right? Like you can't make the players the focus if your objective is to build viewership, right? Now, this is the opposite of my stance with LEC, where I think they should be far more player focused, but that's because they have de facto viewership anyway. They have a full monopoly over it. No one's going to compete with it. They're never going to give co-streaming rights over to anyone else until the league starts fading in viewership like the LCS did, right? That's why they ended up doing co-streaming over there. But when it comes to the ERLs, especially for the NLC, they need to get the viewers in first before they can start capitalizing on it. So I think focusing on internal content around the casters and creating a casting team that people want to watch and want to follow, that will give them something unique to follow that they can only get on the NLC, rather than focusing on the players for it, and I think they should focus more on players once they get a good viewership, where people will be like, well, I could follow this guy, but he's just a worse version of players on other leagues. You can't compete with that. You're not going to be able to compete with that, right? So try to compete with their content.
Yeah. I wonder if it even makes a bit of a difference where they've got the stuff with the BBC as well. They're like, maybe it's sort of it's tricky. They've got one hand, they're trying to go for the core league audience and get them in, where, like you say, maybe focusing on the casters or something might be easier. But then for these newer viewers that they're trying to get, people that don't know League of Legends at all, then it's tricky. Maybe it makes more sense to focus on the game, to actually try and teach them a bit. But then, at the moment they're kind of not really going either way that much anymore.
That's on broadcast, and the point I'm trying to make is that it doesn't just end there, right? In this off season they can do a bunch of content that doesn't have to be broadcast on the BBC. They can do a bunch of online content that people will tune in for, like other casting groups have. The LFL was different. The French scene had a completely different identity. The French scene was actually a rotating land-based scene before it became one stringent league, right? So there were multiple lands a year. It was basically multiple lands a month at one point. And because of this, the French scene had very fast development of storylines, right? So I remember when Gamers Origin came on the scene, for example, when at a time when LDLC were really dominant, Gamers Origin came on the scene, and as they were essentially a bunch of random high elo players who happened to live near each other, and they weren't even exceptionally high elo players, right? They weren't supposed to do anything at the tournament that they initially entered, and they won it. And that was insane. It was insane when Gamers Origin won it. But the problem is that later that month there was another tournament, and that tournament had far worse competition, right? And then Gamers Origin won that, and it's all right, they're on a 2 streak, but the first one could have just been a fluke where none of the teams were respecting them or anything, and then the second one, well, it was a lower sense of competition. Then the third one came in and they beat LDLC twice to win it. They sent them to the lower bracket and then they beat them in the upper bracket. It's okay, we have a new dominant force in the scene that no one saw coming, challenging the LDLC dynasty immediately, that, right? This started a year-long streak with Gamers Origin where the narrative immediately shifted, but we could see the narrative shifting not on the basis of 4 weeks of BO1s, which is terrible for that kind of narrative, but based on actual tournament victories. It's not they beat LDLC in a best of one in the middle of the league. No, they beat them in finals where it fucking mattered, right? Now we know Gamers Origin is the real fucking deal. So then when Gentside came in and had the tournament where they beat Vitality, LDLC, and fucking Gamers Origin, that was a massive fucking deal, right? Because it's a player 3 has entered the game, but we had storylines changing and evolving so fucking much in the French scene, in a way that it couldn't evolve and adapt in any other scene, because they were just doing best of 1 league systems, right? Or best of 3 if it was Spain. And that was how that was what really differentiated the French team from anyone else, was the fact that it was an open circuit tournament. And it was, for me, a really good preview of what could have happened if Riot didn't just homogenize the entirety of the LEC. But now we don't have that. Now it's just its own fucking league. And luckily there are popular enough French streamers that they could then grab in to do their casting, etc. But that's how they did it. So, but no one's ever going to go into that kind of format. So I like talking.
What you're saying is bring back the UKLC Tower format.
Oh, don't.
I
Don't
loved
do
the
that.
Tower format. No, I actually loved it. But the
No.
Tower format was so fucking good for narratives. It was insane because every single game actually mattered. So for viewership, it's even better because if you care about Team X that is at the start of the tower, you actually have to watch the rest of the games of the day because any of these fucking teams could be taking on it and at the end of the tower. Every game also had actual stakes. There was no unimportant game in a tower format. It was actually vastly better for viewership than than any other kind of format would have been. Although now the data is kind of skewed on that, because if you look at the NLC, well, they did a relaunch, they had Twitch featuring them on the front page initially, and they brought on a bunch of Riot casters. But if you didn't do any of that, I'm pretty sure you'd find that Tower format actually had more viewership. I love Tower format.
I would agree if there wasn't just the same two sides who were really good. Like, I was sick and tired of watching Fnatic and X. And you know what? For a wider audience, you want to be seeing Fnatic and XL if you're probably in the UKLC at that point, because they're the two biggest sides. But I just felt like, from a regular viewer perspective, it got to the point where it's like, I'm sick of seeing the same matches. So I think the Tower format does work if you had like 4 or 5 good sides in there where it could be kind of rotating a little bit more. But for me, when you just had kind of 2 dominant sides, and yeah, you did have like the upset kind of victories, partway through it as well. It just didn't. It died off for me as it got to the end. I felt like.
Yeah, I think that's valid. Do you think Tower format might have been better for the current roster of NLC teams?
You probably think so. Like, there was.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Only obviously Fnatic have been like fairly dominant, but then Riddle have taken games off them in the playoffs. You could imagine if they played against them a few times in different weeks, you could easily see it, being more than just those two. Like, did anyone else even win the Tower ever? Or maybe Diabolus won.
Eminem won it as well.
Okay. But yeah, it was like. Yeah, like
it was the 1 week where they paid me for coaching.
I think as well, it's kind of the opposite kind of argument we have for what the format is now, is that now I look at it and I think I wanted to see kind of these sides face each other. So while in the Tower format, I was like, I'm sick of seeing these sides facing each other. Now I'm like, oh, but I actually kind of want to see what Dusty's like against like Eminem, or so I feel like there just needs to be kind of that balance in between, which could potentially just be a league format, let's be honest. But like, it just, it's funny how they've kind of gone from one way to the other, where I think, and it's not just me, I think viewers are the same, where it's like, oh, I kind of wanted to see how the other groups would have competed. But then I guess you talk about narrative, it did actually kind of create a narrative, as there was like always that conversation of, well, which group was better? Was it Group A, Group B, which is at least a basic narrative that you can kind of take, I think.
Sure. I would say, I think right now, towards the start of the split Tricked Esports, for example, I would have expected to take a few towers. For example, I think the league would have been a lot more interesting if it had tower format right now. It's definitely much more competitive than it was. And I think saying that you saw like the same matchup over and over again is a valid criticism. But that being said, there are people who like outright skip games that don't matter right now. So there are theoretically more games people would skip now. But that being said, if they don't want to see BT versus Fnatic again, that's probably a reason to root for all of the other teams in the tower format anyway, right? But I think it's valid criticism. If there are just 2 very dominant teams, the tower format can get stale. So open circuit all the way.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about then, before we do move on to E-Masters, because we've gone almost half an hour already. I wanted to ask you, I remember, I think it was about 6 months ago or so, you did an article, right, on Dexerto, I think, about Origin. And I saw, so was that like the first time you tried that sort of thing? Is that something you'd think about ever doing again as well?
I used to write for the Score Esports back in 2015. So they paid a lot better than Origin did at the time. So went from Origin to doing articles for the Score back when people actually paid for written content. Dexerto are far more interested in video content right now, but they gave me a lot more freedom than even the Score did back in the day. It's just that there isn't really much money in written content, because even if it gets front page on Reddit, that doesn't actually translate into clicks. Is what I was told, and yeah, like I mean, I fully trust on that. So it's not really a good way to make money now. Otherwise, I would. Like, if I could, I would just go and try to write multiple articles a week and do all that. Again, I used to be doing 2 to 3 a week. Recently, last year, actually, was it last year? I think it was last year, early last year, in Spring Split, I was doing an article a week for LoL Esports, but they literally wouldn't let me do any more than that, right? Because the money just isn't there. But yeah, my degree is actually in English literature and creative writing, so that was actually like an optimal use of my degree, was doing writing.
Nice.
I think the problem with Reddit as well, and this is going a little bit out there, is retention rate is not very high. If a post makes it onto Reddit, like from the website which I do, which is like sports business and stuff like that, like whenever a post has got onto Reddit, I immediately know that it's on Reddit because you see the retention rate of those posts just go, they plummet. Like the viewership is high, and that's why I think when in terms of like just from a business perspective, when you're trying to sell kind of like a website to potential client and stuff for advertising, you kind of look at they ask two questions. They ask what the viewership is and then what the retention rate is, because you could easily just post so many of these things on social media. And Reddit is like I said, the big example. You could say like I've got 100,000 clicks a month, but I've got a retention rate of 10 seconds, which means that really they're not clicking on it and reading like the first paragraph, and that they're just clicking away. So it's not really worth it for investors and stuff.
Honestly, if you want consistent money for your content, there are only really two ways to do it, and it's Twitch and it's Patreon. And the reason is that people would think that YouTube is actually lucrative, and YouTube is not very lucrative until you get to be a person that is getting like minimum 100,000 views like a month, etc. But even then, it's very difficult to monetize it. But outside of the monetization issue, YouTube is actually a terrible way to get a following in general, right? Like Loco Doco, for example, was spamming YouTube videos after Listen Loco went downhill, right? And despite the fact that he did all of that, his rate of viewership on Twitch and on Twitter, so like the technical term for it is escaping me. It's like interactions or something like this on Twitter and Twitch was absurdly low and like basically did not shift. He was literally like a 10 viewer average streamer, because YouTube is essentially just SEO abuse. You just abuse to get on recommendeds and to get on the front page of searches, etc. And if you can do that, your video will get viewership. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're building a following, right? And building a following is the big thing. So Twitter's good for building a following, and then transferring it from Twitter onto Twitch is the big thing to do, because Twitch is like the hardest social media to actually do well in at all. The YouTube doesn't really help with following, but things like the Desherto only really want like video scripts now, etc., and to pay you for that. And it's like, well, you can do that, but if you do that, you're not really going to be able to build a consistent following to get like consistent money. And if the money runs out on those videos, then you're a bit screwed, right? So then Twitch becomes the big deal. So then me having a terrible Airbnb right now in terms of internet is a massive disadvantage. But like, yeah, like it's like content is not as simple as people think. Is the point I'm trying to make. Like there is no simple route into making it big, because even if you think you've made it big on like YouTube, for example, that may not even translate into a following whatsoever. There are vastly more popular people than you that have tried and have failed in this regard. There isn't money in a lot of types of content right now. Reddit is not like breaking. Reddit doesn't even get you attention like you're saying. So it's actually a very difficult scene to break into. It requires a lot of luck at the end of the day, or do what I did, which is be there at the start, right? If you're there at the start, and the vast majority of success stories people throw at you about how they went through all of this as well, blah, 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 were people who came into the scene in like 2010. All right, like they have no idea what it's like trying to get up in the scene right now. So if you are an avid content creator, or you are like an org owner or something even, well, first of all, I think you're probably parasitic scum. But if you are like an org owner or something and you're listening to people like Ocelot being like, oh, well, I pushed through all of this, blah, 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 blah. They did it at a completely different time where we all basically rode the wave, right? Like I'm only really relevant right now because I rode the wave. Otherwise, I'd probably be like a bunch of you fucks on Twitter with like 100 followers just yelling into the void, right? With no one listening.
Fair enough.
It's a fair comment.
I mean, it's true. I mean, it's just ultimately
true.
Because like the way everything is structured anyway, and the way everything is structured everywhere in life is that like there is a top and it is a fucking pyramid, and whereas anyone can make it to the top, everyone cannot make it to the top. Like that is as true, right? And the vast majority of you are going to fall into the everyone anyway, and not going to fall into the anyone category. And even if you're all aiming for it, the vast majority of you will have to, by necessity, fail anyway. And just like when you hear all of these BS stories, the vast majority of them were just people who rode the wave at the start, or in almost every case.
And I do agree, because at the end of the day, like, so I'm from a sports journalism background. I'm a full-time journalist on a sports journalism and like a gambling and casino website and stuff. That industry is so much easier to get in than what esports is right now. I couldn't sustain myself if I quit my job, which I wouldn't. I love my job, but if I quit my job, I would not be able to make it in esports journalism, because you're right. You do need the following, and a lot of it kind of with the way it goes now is that you kind of have to have experience even at a top level. Like if someone's a content creator and someone's like a half decent writer and they were former league pro and they've got like a following, a platform like that, they're gonna hire them, because at the end of the day, that's what people are looking for. You know, that's the way that the industry is right now. You do also need those people, because then you can hire someone like that and then maybe hire a journalist under that who can work and kind of build that following and build that quality. So I completely agree. Like with the way that the esports industry is right now, it is very much like you throw a ball and whoever catches it kind of gets it at this point.
And it's like it's very far away from what people would imagine it would be anyway if you do get the job. Like for example, over at ESPN, they are very much encouraged to diversify. You cannot just be like a League of Legends specialist and be at ESPN, right? You can barely be an esports specialist right now and be at ESPN. You are encouraged to go for a bunch of other kind of areas within ESPN as well if you're over there right now, right? And there are only like 3 people who are consistently on the payroll over there, and they aren't even bringing in extra people to do their lists anymore. Like the money is not there. The golden age, if you wanted to get into esports writing, was in 2016. So just after I left esports journalism, the golden age kind of happened, which I never regretted. My tenure on H2K is still some of the best times of my life. But back then, that was when Yahoo came in, right? Yahoo came in with Travis and Kelsey and Emily and all of that. Like they got all of like the big stars back in the day there, and they paid them all like 125k a year, 200k a year, shit like this, and then they didn't even make it through the fucking year because there is no money to be made in esports journalism in that regard, right? People are struggling to make money on the org side of things now. There are now 2 organizations that are profitable in North America, but that is massive. That is massive because no one else is fucking profitable. No one else can figure this fucking shit out. And those guys are fucking super orgs. They've dipped in every fucking pool, but they mostly rode the wave in every fucking pool as well. These aren't teams like XL, right? Who've essentially recently bought in based on a massive investment that they got very, very recently, right? Those guys are going to struggle a lot harder than those ones, than the TSMs and the Cloud9s of the world, because the TSM and the Cloud9s of the world are so massive, operate on such a massive fucking scale, that eventually they were going to fucking make profits somehow, you know? But they could take more risks than a team like XL could ever take, right? Like no one knows how to make money right now. So you're kidding yourself if you think you're going to consistently get paid here, because even the people at the top are struggling to get paid right now. But they will be completely fine if everything collapses. You will not be fine if you quit your job that you currently love.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
exactly. You will not be fine.
No, and this is 100%. Yeah, I absolutely, like, to be fair, like, it's not like a brag, but like I spent like basically the entire week writing about esports last week. So this week was the ESI digital summer virtual event about esports business. So I got given the chance to cover all that for a week. So if you want to see any of the articles, they're in there. They're in my thread. But that kind of highlighted that it's not just kind of journalism. It's every bit of esports. It's kind of like every place. I mean, they were talking about broadcasting at one point, and there's no Arabic broadcast in the Middle East right now for some esports. And that's insane. You know, when you kind of look at how we think that it's hard in like America and Europe, but there's other countries it's just even worse. It's such a minority right now still, even though we're in this bubble.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, actually, and I've actually personally received some of these. There are people within Saudi Arabia that are very, very interested in just creating an esports scene in general. Like the Neon project, for example, the prince involved in that has actually reached out to multiple people in the scene to try to get them over there to run their esports side over the graves of everyone that they are forcing out. Like they are taking massive strides over there, but these are the people that you do want to come into the scene if you want the scene to be able to make money. Because I've talked about this concept before, but like regular sports is also a bubble in a similar way that people call esports a bubble, right? Now in esports we are getting teams that are profitable, and in sports you do have teams that are profitable, but you get into international football, and the counterweight to all of that keeps injecting money into the scene is Russian billionaires and Saudi princes and billionaire children from China, etc., that are pumping money in because they essentially use these football teams as toys. They don't actually care about making
it's true.
profit.
We
So
think
it's a
even
bunch of money coming in that doesn't ever have to come out, and they won't ever fucking pull out because of that, because it's just a massive fucking game for them, right? And our equivalent of that is China. And it's also partly why China is doing really, really well, is that Chinese teams are owned by a bunch of billionaire sons who are crashing their Lamborghinis at the age of 21 and then playing on stage with Jackie Love and forcing Riot to have to change all of their fucking rule sets based around who can and cannot play if you are an owner or not. Well, I think they won that game, actually. I can't remember they won that game. I think they actually fucking won that game. But they are owned by kids who are treating them as toys on daddy's money, right? And they aren't going to be asking for a lot of money back. So they are willing to make the investments and take the risks that the coaching staff wants to win, right? But over in the West, where everyone is still just trying to make money, we don't have any of that kind of stuff coming in. They're creating the role of the GM, right? The role of the GM is one of those roles that I think exists purely to say that Marx was correct, where the role of the GM is essentially to take control away from the coach when it comes to the roster, because the coach will only take competitive factors into account. The GM will take marketing factors into account, right? Which is why in North America, the fact that GMs are now running everything is a very, very bad thing competitively for the region, right? You don't really want that sort of a thing. You look at the GMs that we have in Europe, or the GM run teams that we have in Europe, it's what? It's Origin, it's Misfits, it's teams like this. And we look at the teams that are still run predominantly by their coaching staff, not to say that all coaches are perfect, please never fucking mistake this for that, but with the intent clearly being competitivity, right? It's like Mad Lions, right? They essentially entirely built the team around winning. Ocelot is pretty much suicidal when it comes to wanting to win, right? And it happens to be that he can now make money at the same time as winning. But he was fully willing to give as much control as possible as he could to Perks' opinion, right? And to try to create a winning team that way. Like, these are the teams that are doing well. But if we move into a GM format like North America has, sure, a bunch of people like you could probably trick owners into getting jobs, but we will lose competitively because of that. This is the thing that's keeping us competitive with China right now. But once we start getting like the big boys coming in and treating all this shit like toys, one day some tech billionaire's gonna fucking do that. Like, I was actually talking with someone in business in North America one day, and he's like, you say esports is a bubble, but people are profitable right now in North America. Here's how they are profitable, and who fucking cares anyway, because some tech billionaire is going to start treating us like Monopoly at one day anyway. And it's like, yeah, that's perfectly true. That's exactly what we have been waiting for the whole fucking time. One day it's going to fucking happen. Hasn't happened yet. North America terrifies me, because North America is what will happen to the scene if that never fucking happens. Otherwise, you know, like we'll just end up never being competitive with China, who will always have this advantage over us.
Let's I think we'll make a segue now into EU Masters. We'll have to start eventually. So before we get into the actual groups themselves and start looking at sort of the strength of each side, I did just want to start by talking a bit about the LDLC the knockout with Riddle. Obviously, we're sort of mostly focused around the UK scene, which means that we mostly cover the NLC. So Riddle was one of our 2 chances to have a decent run at EU Masters. They actually looked pretty good, I thought, in groups, and they had a good bit of form in the NLC as well. Obviously, they did eventually lose to Fnatic. But against LDLC, it didn't even look close. And even just starting with the first game, I wanted to get your opinions, Veteran, even just on the draft, because I'm not like some high-level analyst or anything, but when I just looked at their draft, I couldn't even work out what was supposed to work together. Like, they had like Misfortune bot, but then there didn't really seem to be anything that could even sort of lock people up much to get a good ulti off or anything. There just didn't seem to be stuff that really matched to me in their comp. So yeah, what were your thoughts, at least on just seeing the plan?
I mean, it's a straight losing draft, but these guys have played really heavily around like Maxi's desires beforehand. So when I look at this draft, I think, okay, top lane will have priority on first crash, mid lane will have priority on first crash, and bot lane is screwed the moment that you let Caitlyn Morgana through. But it is a team that was looking heavily for priorities to play through Nidalee, right? The problem with that is that if you aren't giga smurfing on your side of the map on top side and Tinks doesn't like fuck up and just let you free quadrant him, then you're going to get heavily outscaled anyway by the composition on the left regardless. You're never going to get that priority on bot side. You're not going to be able to double scuttle him even. The moment that you're on red side and you let over Caitlyn Morgana like this and you don't have a good response to it, then you should really honestly be FFing in this scenario. And then when it gets to later on in the game, even though your mid lane should theoretically have an advantage, VTRX Kicks champions will just heavily outrange all of your champions anyway, and Nidalee becomes functionally useless if she's not hitting a spear. Whereas on the other hand, you have Tinks and Bando creating as much disruption as they possibly can, and then with their ranges, you have no real counterplay versus them at all, right? So I thought this was a really terrible fucking draft from Riddle. Like 100% this is a terrible draft from Riddle. Right now, I think range is king in the meta, and so just on that basis, LDLC's composition should be winning. But if you're picking Nidalee and you don't even secure 3 winning lanes, and you're not really securing like monster strong top side anyway on early phase, he's probably going to look to get like a third wave crash into Kolbai. In which case Bando's going to be able to get push on that, and then Tix will be able to escort, and then Maxi won't even be able to do anything topside on jungle anyway in that scenario. Like you limit completely the options for Maxi. It's far from like the worst jungle matchup that I saw this tournament, but like this was pretty bad. And like in the second composition, their comp was better, but LDLC's composition just team fights in a way more effective and easy manner than theirs does. I'm not really sure what their composition wants to do outside of straight 1-3-1 with Jhin doing half roams. But if you are looking to do that, the easiest way to counter that would be to force heavily on midsection. So you're putting a certain level of execution onto your 3-man mid, which is your bot lane, and Rayhay kind of is a massive inter. I never know if I'm pronouncing his name properly, by the way.
Raya, but with a bit more flair.
Well, yeah. So you're putting like an awful lot of pressure on Raya and Maxi to actually be able to pull it off in midsection, which isn't going to happen versus the heavy amount of force that is available in LDLC's team. You can't feasibly expect this of Riddle at all, and especially not of those players.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I thought they lost draft both times. I thought their drafts were fairly confused, but also it's drafts that would work really well versus like a worse team that isn't expecting it, or like a team that is really fucking nervous playing against them or feeling a lot of pressure. Like a team that won't immediately be able to capitalize on you or be decisive enough to like attack your midsection or be able to respond to your early parving or play aggressive enough to counter it or anything like this. Like it would abuse a team or in a worse off position than LDLC would be. LDLC probably felt really confident coming into this series.
Mm-hmm.
I think it just felt a bit sad as well. Like if I'm being honest, that was kind of just what I felt like during this series, because it was I know because it's LDLC, and LDLC probably well they were the best side in play-ins. There's no doubt about that. They're probably better than some sides which are actually in the main event anyway. But it kind of felt like after the first game, that was kind of Riddle's run over. As soon as I saw that first game, for me it felt like, well, okay, this is it. This is the wall which Riddle have met. And I know that obviously that you can put the excuse of their schedule was absolutely stupid. Like it really was. No team should have to play that amount of games in a row, if I'm being honest. But yeah, I felt like kind of Riddle basically gave up after that first game. It did feel like, unfortunately.
I mean, I'm not sure about LDLC's chances in this tournament, and if Riddle are going to get completely rolled over by them, then I don't think they were gonna do much in the tournament anyway. Not gonna lie, because the interesting thing about this tournament compared to last tournament is that last tournament you were able to play really heavy tank setups on top side, so suddenly players like Beansu looked like a god. and it was easier to disguise the flaws of players like Bando. But right now, like even just looking at the match history, you see across the board, it's like Lilia, it's Camille everywhere. Gangplank is really popular again, and not just as an anti-tank. Jax is here, Wukong is here, blah blah blah. Like a lot of really heavy carry tops are in the meta now as well. And with that, it's going to be far harder to disguise Bando's flaws. And the way that they have previously been doing that is by having Tinks put heavy priority onto top side rather than just try to snowball bot side as hard as they possibly can. And with doing this, when they had stuff like Maokai Scion and topside permanently, it was about setting up for Tinks's damage carry. But now the 2v2 actually matters a lot. So they'll be heavily contested in that, and I don't think they will always win that. And as a result, I'm not sure that they'll be able to mask their big flaw like they were able to last time. And if Doxy and Maxi weren't able to expose that flaw versus them, they're not going to be able to expose that flaw versus much bigger teams with much stronger 2v2 top sides, like, for example, Mouse Sports, right? Or Rogue, or Misfits Premier, or any team like this.
Enough. Let's I think let's move on then and actually take a look then at some of the groups. So what we'll do is just go through each group one by one, talk about the teams in there, who we think is strongest, and yeah, we'll just go from there. So starting with Group A then. So who do you see first of all even getting out of that group? So we've got obviously, I'd say the top three would obviously be Schalke, Kick, and LDLC. Not being harsh to Morning Stars, but I don't think many people would give them much of a chance of getting out. So yeah, how do you see this group going? Because we've obviously got LDLC, obviously like we said, just got through against Riddle. It's kind of like it's the rematch from spring. So we've got Kick and LDLC both finalists against each other, but like you said, maybe LDLC not quite as strong given the meta as they would have been. So do you think they'll have much of a chance still? Because Schalke have looked fairly decent, I suppose, until obviously the final against Mouse where they got swept.
I mean, I never bought into the Schalke hype train even last split. I never really bought into this because Schalke were a team that had strong team-based fundamentals. And all I mean with that is that they never took fights on number disadvantage. They never took fights in areas where they didn't have priority and blah, blah, blah. Like really simple system stuff like this, where they were never in a position where you could easily capitalize on them, or which more often happens in ERLs, where you just going ham because you had a feeling that you could go ham right now was actually correct. It was never actually correct versus Schalke that you could go ham at that point. They've been a lot more inconsistent in this specific area, and then once they're inconsistent in that, you find out that the individual talent on that team isn't really there in the way that it is on a team like Mouse Sports. I think that individually players like Certus and Sleeping got very, very overrated in a way that I don't think they necessarily deserved. I think they're good, but I never viewed them as like S tier players. I view Sleeping as like a B tier player, and I viewed Certus as maybe an A tier player. That mid is very competitive in Europe. So I wasn't necessarily surprised when they dropped. When they dropped last split, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't make it out of this group, because I don't think when I look at like Sleeping plus Lowux that I'm seeing a jungle top that is going to make a massive difference versus a jungler like Tinks. And I think VTO is actually performing pretty well. And then Schlatten forces like an absolute maniac on Kick's side. And the thing with Schlatten, I think Schlatten's a bit overrated as well, but I think what Schlatten does is better versus bad teams than what Lowux does. And what Lowux is really good at is in like mid-game split map scenarios. That's when he's really fucking good, but not early game. I don't think Schlatten's good early game either, but what Schlatten does is that Schlatten will essentially like oink in the lane and just wait to force on them, but he'll do it in really terrible wave states a lot, where he shouldn't actually be looking for a gank, but it's way too early for him to be realistically escorting the lane in any way. But sometimes these guys will just step up for no reason. He'll get the fucking gank off. And then the higher level team he goes up against, the worse he looks, because they stop stepping up, right? Which is why he suddenly looks really bad. last year around about semis and started getting carried by the rest of his team. But quarters, I mean. But I think that could actually be pretty good versus Schalke, because Schalke are lacking in these fundamental areas right now. So yeah, I think Kick and LDLC coming out over Schalke wouldn't necessarily surprise me.
I definitely look at Kick as like they're the team to lose. Like they're the team which should be top in this group. For me, I actually look at them and I think they've got, well, to get Mystiques in, I think they look better than what they did last split. I think they actually look like a really good side. They kept 4 of the members, and I think they had an upgrade in having Mystiques in my opinion. I think that the playoffs, there's always this side which when they're from the playoffs, the play-in, sorry, they can always work their way up because they have that momentum going. LDLC will have that momentum, I think, coming into this group, and I think that will also help. And it's not an unusual thing. It happens a lot of the time in EU Masters. You see a playing group who there's always at least one who will dominate, and they'll get to at least the semi-finals because they've just had this momentum going through. They've kind of had this practice a little bit against weaker sides, but still going in. So for me, if I had to pick 2, it would be Kick top and then probably LDLC. I agree with Schalke. I'm very unsure about Schalke, but I'm unsure with a couple the other Prime League sides as well, especially kind of the only side I'm really confident in is Mouse, if I'm being completely honest, because despite them having not the greatest start to the season, obviously they changed that around and they look like a really, really good side going into it. But for me, Kick's the side who should be top in this group, and I would probably edge it to LDLC.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately,
I think LDLC, Kick, then Schalke, then Samsung would be what I would say. I also think the reason why teams coming out of play-ins end up doing really well is not really to do with momentum. I think it's because there are patch changes between the playoffs that they qualify for EU Masters on and EU Masters itself. And as a result, once the meta shift occurs, what were previously really close results in playoffs would now go the other way on the current meta, right? Like if you go back to Polish League, tank tops were still the predominant thing, whereas if you look now, it's mostly carry tops. So generally what happens is that the actual top seed of the region is now in play-ins because of a meta shift. And so they do really well in play-ins, and then they do really well in the tournament as well. And people are like, oh, going through play-ins must be an advantage. When actually it's just the fact that we don't do consistent patches for playoffs and worlds, or playoffs and EU Masters in this case, right? This happens all the fucking time. This is why it's the exception rather than the rule that the first place team in a region will win the world championships, right? That only happened with SKT and recently FPX.
Let's take a look at Group B then. So Group B, we've got Rogue, Movistar Riders, Sup Esports, obviously formerly Energy Pop Wizards, and Gamer Legion being the 4th seed through play-ins. But with Gamer Legion, would you sort of rate them in the top 2?
It's so
Gamer
hard.
Legion is bait. Gamer Legion is bait, man. Like Knight, for example, I don't really think is very good. No offense, Knight, if you're watching somehow, but he has a very shallow champ pool. Hianen's shallow champ pool is masked by the fact that his shallow champ pool consists of really weird champions. Phones is just not good. Full stop. And Rabble needs a lot of work. I think Wisdom is probably the best player on that team, but he doesn't get many optics because he's not doing as many crazy picks as Knight and Hyonan are doing. And they got by mostly because they're doing crazy picks that if you're playing them that week, you won't have scrimmed against that week because you're not scrimming against them, right? But everyone figured them out by the time of playoffs. And G2 Arctic probably should have beaten them as well. And people would have viewed that as an upset. But it would only really be an upset for me because that would mean that the G2 organization, through their consistent policy of just outsourcing their academy team and not giving a flying fuck about it, would have finally made EU Masters. I think Gamer Legion's bait, whereas on Movistar, I still really like Elioya. My issue with Movistar is I'm not sure how Beansu's going to do now that we're shifting away from a tank meta. But versus phones, I wouldn't really worry, right? Versus phones, Rabble, I think Beansu and Elioya win that. I think Java was a very underrated component of their roster just because somehow Rux is the new Treats and has gained the entirety of social media to SSD. But I think he's a very underrated player, so I think they're actually pretty competitive in general. Again, I think Knight's really overrated, so I think Gamer Legion could just not make it out of Group B. I think it could be a very bad tournament for Prime League again, basically, with Mouse Sports being the only team that makes it out. Even them, they're in the group of death.
And to be fair, that Gamer Legion, I think that series against G2, that like it wasn't like a clean, easy win. Like, I think the first game was like 45-minute, basically. Whoever wins that fight wins the game, and then it was only really game 3 that was a bit more one-sided, but it wasn't a convincing series win by any means.
Yeah.
Who would you say?
I think as well, you've got to kind of look at, like, I look at Ego Road and I look at Movistar Riders, and these were two sides which I believe did they make semis, I think, was it last split? And they've basically run back the same squad apart from the support for Ego Road. So it's not like an easy group. I think they could have been put into another group and it might have been a little bit different. But for me, I look at Movistar and I do look at Ego Rogue, and especially seeing Gamer Legion in playoffs, I'm just not convinced by them. I'm really not.
Do you think it could be the case with Gamer Legion, like where you say, I don't know, maybe Hyana does have like a bit of a weird pool and stuff? Do you see that might help at least just in like the best of one group stage, but they maybe just wouldn't get far in knockouts?
I mean, if these guys are really incompetent, sure, but they would just be playing off their incompetency. Like, they should do their research. There are no new picks that they're going to bring out. These guys don't bring out anything new. They just bring out consistently weird stuff you won't have scrimmed against. But you can do your research at this point. That's why everyone had their numbers in playoffs. Maybe they do end up choosing a game because of it or something. But the most weird thing they'll do is like a lane swap scenario of like Sion, Jinx, and Ziggs or something like this, right? But these are things that are known quantities, so it's really on those teams that they get caught out by them.
Fair enough. Let's take a look at Group C then. Group C, we've got the third Polish side, so the third seed from Poland, but then
this group is something else. Like,
and then we've got obviously the Greek. I think it was the Greek first seed, is it, or second seed? I'm not sure. And then we've got Misfits and Vodafone Giants. I look at this and the first thing I thought was like, if only one of our Fnatic or Riddle could have made their way into here, because like we kind of talked about it. Me and Tom at least. I think it was just in the DMs. Like, we've seen Ultraliga get this extra seed, and it may just be salty that the NLC didn't get it, but it kind of feels like the third team, like they don't really have a third team that's going to do much. Like, what do you make of Pompa team?
Of Pompa team?
Yeah.
Jesus, of all the fucking questions I thought I was going to be asked, I definitely didn't think I was going to be asked this today. So I like Pompa team's mid, who I will butcher the pronunciation of probably if I ever tried.
Yeah, they're all quite complicated.
Wait, actually, they have a thing on Leaguepedia. No, okay, no, I have it for this day.
No, not even trying.
It's going to be like Sarjak or something like this. Yeah. But I like him. I don't expect this roster to make it out. I don't expect this roster to make it out at all. So whereas I do like their mid laner, I think that the former Devils 1, which the majority of these players are from, right, was God, man. It is so Devils 1 was an exceptionally good team before they got these guys, and the problem with these guys is whereas initially they were showing at least half decent fundamentals, they've never had the individual talent there, and their jungle support has pretty much never looked like it's understood any sort of proper aspect of map play in general. I actually think with Poland, you get like a really weird dichotomy where like there's a massive drop down after like the top two. It's the most absurdly top heavy region of any fucking region in the ERLs, right? To the point where I didn't even come prepared for Pompa team because I figured we were just going 100% write them off. I like their mid, but I think these guys need like a lot more coaching and fundamentals before they're going to be a massive challenger to any of these teams.
Yeah.
Like I look at these teams and I think that with Misfits Premier, for example, there's no way they do anything to their top or their bot lane. There's just way too much individual talent on that. And I think their jungle support is not going to be able to shut down what is a kind of lackluster jungle support system that Misfits Premier are running. But Kire revels in a team that is worse than him on an individual basis anyway. Like, he really loves elongated map split scenarios where he can just permanently make individual plays on side lanes. And this team will just give it to him. This team will just give it to him. On Vodafone's side, I think the bot half of their map is one of the most absurdly talented bot halves of the map in the whole of the ERLs. Even though Pretty has been there since time immemorial, and Attila is a world's player, like, obviously it would seem like a natural thing to say. But Dote, I think, is one of the best supports in the region, and if you don't have a good jungle support system, you will get caught out here, if not just by him alone, to be honest. And then with D'Antonio, I mean, don't give him Cho'Gath, don't give him Sion, and then has to default to either Irelia or Poppy historically. But just don't give him those champions, and maybe you have like a chance of abusing that, but this is not the team that's going to take advantage of it. I think this is Premier's a team that could take advantage of that. But if you are burning your bans on D'Antonio, Pretty, Attila, and don't get everything that they want, and then if they get everything they want and bottom half of the map is just going to be theirs for the entire time, you're probably not going to be able to 5-level Llama Bear like Tinks did once. So I don't really see Palpatine really doing much here. I don't think they have the fundamental things you need to be competitive with the top teams. But you know what? Maybe I'll end up eating my words. We'll see.
No, I only wanted to ask about that because, I think because we're a bit salty about the seeding. Not gonna lie.
I think it is a top two. But then again, if I'm being completely honest, apart from this split, you could probably argue that it was a top two in the UK and in the UK scene as well. So,
yeah, true.
Yeah, but so it's funny getting your opinion on Vodafone Giants, because I kind of looked at this group and my immediate opinion was, well, this is just Misfits Premier. Like I kind of looked at that and I thought, well, Misfits Premier for me looked like one of the best sides in EU Masters. So it's interesting to see kind of like have it. I think because, and I actually put in this, I think a lot of people underrate Pretty, and I think that's another thing, is because I think he is consistent. I think he's good at he's a good, ERL player. I don't think he's ever going to amount to anything more, but I think he's consistent. But I kind of look at Misfits Premier, and I don't know if it's just because it's the most team with Fnatic Rising former members in Targamas and Ronaldo, but I kind of counted out everybody else, and I thought that it would be Vodafone second, but how good are Misfits Premier then? Do you not think that? I thought that they were the best side coming into EU Masters.
I don't know if they're the best side. I don't have a super favorable view of their mid lane. And I think Kire works in very specific circumstances. I also think Jezu, I really like, I liked the initial things I saw from Jezu in terms of his team fighting, and specifically his positioning in that scenario. But I think the biggest strength from them is still Targamas and Aggressivo. I'm just interested to see how the meta shifts with the spellbook nerfs, because that will tell me a lot about the relative strength of Ronaldo versus Pretty. Because Pretty is not a assassin player historically. This has always been a massive blind spot for him, which I even abused in Challenger Series myself, by blind picking Corki into him with Zed open, knowing that he literally didn't have a single game of Zed across any of his accounts ever in his entire life. And the spellbook nerfs, the big thing that they bring back is assassins, because previously versus a big assassin, you would just go unsealed spellbook, you would retain TP, but you'd also have exhaust, barrier, heal, blah, 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 blah. Everything that you would need to survive from an assassin as well, without having to give up that free base that you could otherwise get if they are able to burn through all of your shit. The unsealed spellbook nerf potentially brings assassins back in, and then Pretty could struggle. But if it doesn't bring assassins in force, then Pretty's mage-based champ pool is actually perfect for this specific tournament. And then I actually would start to favor him over Ronaldo. I think Ronaldo's always been overrated. I'm not quite sure how it began. But I mean, he had a massive buyout from Fnatic actually that Misfits paid for, and then they just never fucking used him on the main team. It was really funny actually. But but there was like a mystique behind Ronaldo for some reason that people were really buying into, even though he's like a Diamond 1 player. But yeah, I worry a bit about Jezu, because even though initially I really liked his positioning and stuff in team fights, that's still the most I can say about him. His laning isn't like exceptional. I think Targamas kind of carries a lot of the weight on that bot lane right now. But I see windows for Attila and Adota, therefore, to actually do really well. Potential window for Pretty to do really, really well. And then it's about Agressivo Kire trying to carry their half of the map harder than him. I don't think it's as clear cut as you're saying.
Fair enough. I always presumed with Ronaldo going there, wasn't it? Jandro was the coach at Fnatic and then at Misfits. I just presumed that. Yeah.
But what did Handro see them? Like, that doesn't answer anything.
Yeah.
I mean, by that, didn't Handro see him as a support? Like, by that logic, he saw him as a support, and then they put him in as
He saw him as 3 different roles. He saw him as 3 different roles. Like,
should we talk about WLG, or are we just kind of thinking that they're just going to be bottom? I feel a bit sad, actually, because... Well,
I actually really liked Paris. Every time I've seen Paris play, I've actually really liked him. But other than that, yeah, I am assuming this is the team that's going to be bottom there. But WLG have actually historically had upsets, but they've never had upsets to the point where they were actually threatening to leave their group. Yeah.
Okay. Then yeah, moving on then to the last group. So we do have our final NLC survivor, in Fnatic Rising, but they've
best group.
found themselves in a bit of a tricky group, I think. So they've got Gamers Origin, and Mouse, and then Intrepid Fox as the other Greek seed as well. How do we rate Fnatic's chances of getting out then? I don't.
Yeah, better jungler wins.
Well, yeah. To be fair, I was thinking like this is like a huge tournament, I think, for Dan, because we've seen him now in the last couple of years, really, in the UKLC and the NLC, and he still does look like clearly the best jungler in that league. He, to be honest, looks like he doesn't belong in that league anymore. And for NLC viewers, I'm sure that a lot of them are hoping he can at least get a chance. Maybe if not straight in the LEC, at least on another academy team that's probably more willing to do some changes around. And for me, this is a tournament for him where, yeah, it's like obviously the last thing he's going to play in this year, and I think it's really huge that he has a bit of success. But obviously, like we said, found himself in a pretty difficult group. How do we rate Fnatic's chances of actually of getting out then and making a run?
I mean, Dan's deserved LEC for a long time. The 3 ERL junglers who actually understand jungling are Dan, Tinks, and Shinkrov. And then after that, Zanzibar needs to work on pool, though I do think he understands the fundamentals of jungling. He needs to work on pool. And Blue Azor sometimes looks like he understands the fundamentals of jungling, which to me indicates that he doesn't actually understand the fundamentals. He just sometimes is incidentally correct, right? So I think there's a massive drop off after you get to the initial 3 that I named versus all the other junglers. Zanzor is the one that is closest to threatening, and then maybe Blue Azor. But it's that Blue Azor might one day realize what he is consistently doing that is correct, and throw out all the stuff that is wrong. I'm not sure he's going to do it in the space of this tournament, though. But I think Obsess is going to get completely destroyed by Dan. But then it's about leader versus Magic Felix, right? Because as a jungler, you can't really do much if your laners aren't able to get priority and play with you. They paint you paint the outline, but they have to color it in, kind of deal. I also think when it comes to top side, Shemek has always historically had a resurgence when it comes to EU Masters, so he might be able to do a lot here versus Pride. Tolkien, there's a lot of hype around him right now, and I'm not quite sure where it comes from. They kind of leave him alone, and he keeps getting Mordekaiser, and then people are shocked that he's winning like that. But that seems to be the game plan for him. But then when it comes to bot lane, I'm actually quite worried about that, because Mr. Love Rap, aka Bravado, I feel like he's going to struggle versus Mouse Sports. He is struggling anyway in the NLC. And Xmati, who I think is a very strong AD carry, kind of ends up being let down by him a lot. I was amazed when he got MVP in the finals in NLC. Actually, I have no idea who he paid to get that. He looked to me like he was running it in that series for sure. I'm kind of worried about the bot lane as a whole as a result of that in the tournament. Magic Felix kind of depends on how important the game is, I guess, is what the cliche is. But I think he'll beat Takuri, and then it's a case of what he does versus Leader, because now there are spellbook nerfs, so Leader might actually be like ridiculously strong in this tournament. And then if these pieces are falling, I don't think there's anything Dan could do to get them out. But I would be willing to say that they can beat Gamers Origin as is, because I think Huston Beast is pretty bad anyway, and Matty is better than Smiley, and Magic Felix is better than Takuri, and Pride, I mean, we'll see what happens with Shemek, but then Dan just has to worry about top side, right? And Dan will have options in that game to play around, and he will be the better jungler versus Blue Azor. Depends. If Blue Azor comes in with a level 1 plan and plays hard and fast, he knows how to snowball the fuck out of that. If he's denied a level 1 plan where he plays hard and fast, then I think Dan will be able to beat him handily. A lot of it will come down to draft, obviously. Sorry about this. A lot of that will come down to draft, obviously. But I think versus Gamers Origin, Dan has the best chance. And then versus Mouse Sports, Obsess isn't going to do anything to stifle Dan. But his laners could prevent him doing anything, and Mouse Sports historically will be willing to draft stuff like Callista Taric bot lane with priority top lane from Tolkien, like a Mordekaiser or some shit, and then just play heavily for leaders lane with Promiscue, etc. But that will shut down Dan's ability to really do much either. Or he could watch a bunch of footage of Obsess and realize Obsess isn't going to play properly around that palming and just create a bunch of artificial holes for him to snowball anyway. That could actually be pretty good versus them. So I think they make it out, and I think maybe Gamers Origin miss out on making it out of this group, and that would be kind of a big upset for France. I think they're looking at this and thinking they're going to get Gamers Origin out, but I think it will just be Mrs. Premier for them.
And
I think LDLC.
I think the way that I put it was, out of the French sides which Fnatic could have got, I'm glad that it's Gamers Origin. I think out of all of them, I mean. And I don't think that necessarily means that they're a bad side. I just think, obviously, with the options available, I'm glad that it was Game of Origin. I do think that what gives me more confidence with Fnatic is the fact that while I do think that Bravado isn't like the best player, obviously, in Fnatic side, he has improved over what he has been doing over a split, and same with Pride. And those were always, and from the beginning of the split, always throughout, it's always been, yeah, you've got that good three of like Dan, Magic Felix, and Xmati, but have the other two kind of improved from what it was last split? And I do think they have got better. I do think, obviously, you'll talk about like Callista, Taric. I do think if you try that against Fnatic Rising, I think you run the risk of maybe Bravado getting the Taric, and you don't want that to happen, I think, at all. So I do think that it is going to be probably Fnatic then Mouse. But I agree. I think that the leader Magic Felix matchup is going to be so interesting to see how kind of what Magic Felix are we kind of going to get, I think, in terms of the style of play as well, because we've seen him a lot more on like roamers this split, with like Twisty Fett and Galio, but obviously meta's kind of changing a little bit more. I don't want to see kind of Magic Felix go for a full-on fight with leader. I want him to play a little bit smarter and kind of play around the team. But he could easily be a type of player where he kind of wants to beat leader in lane. He feels like that type of player who kind of wants to show that he still has that ability. So that is the matchup I'm definitely looking. Yeah, I think so. I think he'd want to prove himself.
The guy who played Azir versus Akali and just kept the lane in the middle for the entirety of Pre-6, definitely not. This guy would rather cut off his left arm than risk that. Like he's never. No, that's definitely not how Magic Felix rolls. He's not going to try to like hard press leader, and leader is a massive blind spot for him historically because he knows that leader will kill him if he missteps. So he plays too safe if anything. So I disagree with that. I disagree with that entirely. I think it will be like the opposite of what you just said.
Do you see the
which is an issue for Dan?
Yeah.
Do you see the meta sort of generally going against Magic Felix then? Because if you, like you said, it's sort of veering more towards assassins. He does look most comfortable on those those kind of safer picks, like a lot of Corki, Azir, like Twisted Fate and stuff that we've seen throughout his time on Fnatic, really. So do you see that he could struggle with, even if they do try and, well, if and when they they get out of groups against tougher teams.
Yeah, and leader could actually resurge with that is like the bigger point, I think. Because this matchup suddenly becomes a massive, rather than Akali being like a niche pick that leader did here. That was a tournament where leader had to do like Azir and shit like this just because the meta was heavily demanding it, right? I do think though that he has expanded into stuff like set, right? So stuff like this could actually be pretty good versus assassins still. His Galio could still be pretty good, but his Twisted Fate that he's had all his best performances on this year, that could be on its way out now. With the spellbook nerfs, and leader could really want you to be blinding that early. He could just come in and bring an assassin in on that. So that can be an issue. I think that I'd be interested to see how his Galio adapts to it. I think Predator Galio is actually really good tech right now if he wants to just avoid leader the whole goddamn time. Because with Predator Galio, you rush boots the swiftness, and that counters the slow on your W. And then you just use Predator to gank side lanes perm, and there's nothing scarier than a Galio running at you with W activated as if it's not slowing him down, because it isn't slowing him down if you rush swiftness boost. But you do seed like heavy lane advantage for it. But he kind of does that versus leader anyway. So veering him more that direction could be something that they could try to do. But you could also maybe just put Dan on some certain picks that could maybe counter leader's champ pool in assassins. So something with real gank priority and heavy CC could be something you could do, and just permanently gank leader on midsection, because Magic Felix will manipulate the wave to his side anyway. These are the kinds of things that they could try to do to get around that issue, but that is assuming that Pride doesn't get shafted by Tolkien in the top lane, and that bot lane isn't getting shafted 2v2, because if those things are happening, Mao's probably come out on top. And I do see that happening. Like, I think it would be Mao's first, Fnatic second, Origin third.
And then moving on for the group then, and to sort of start bringing this episode to a close.
And well done in Intrepid Fox for getting in this group as well. They got in. That's all that matters to them, I think, at this point.
But we won't mention the seeding or lack of it in play-ins either. But yeah, just to kind of bring it to an end then, who do you see as being the kind of overall favourite then? Who do you think is most likely to actually win the whole thing? I'd imagine, not rating LDLC's chances too high of retaining it as a holders.
I mean, I think it will be one of Mouse Sports Misfits Premier or Rogue. That would be what I would say from the outset. But this is another tournament where it's kind of too close to call. But I would say it's those three. If I thought it was close enough to call, I would call it. I was completely correct both times last year when I called it. So I'll say that. But maybe LDLC surprise me and make it up there, but I doubt it. I think it will be one of Rogue, Mrs. Premier, or Mouse Sports. Probably not Fnatic though. Sorry.
Fair enough. To be fair, for me, I would have thought Mouse most likely. To be honest, like when in spring, like I think without doing too much research, I was thinking I just like look at Mouse's lineup. I was like, yeah, sure, like they'll definitely win. And then obviously they hadn't played like the team sheet kind of looks, or that kind of strength anyway. But then this time around, we have obviously seen them actually picking it up. The final against Schalke was very one-sided. I think, with that momentum, they would be favourites for me, I think.
I would go for Misfits, but I can also see maybe Kick also, pulling another one of those styles. It depends. Because I really do think that obviously Mystiques is a big pickup for Kick. But if I do have to look, I know it's like, for me, Misfits Premier look like the favourites and probably are going to win it. But I do agree that there are like other good sides which I think could easily contest.
Definitely.
No love for Rogue.
Because they nicked our bloody seed, that's why.
That's Pomper. That's all Pomper.
That was Pomper. Rogue have Sigenda and Zanzor. So they have actually a massively stacked roster. to be honest. Like better jungler does not win when it gets to higher levels of EU Masters, because then you get to a point where the skill discrepancy between lanes is so massive that jungle is almost irrelevant, because they aren't able to play out their win conditions anyway. They're at the mercy of their lanes because the skill discrepancy is that large, which is why Obsess and Donarts won EU Masters last year, right? Despite being two of the worst junglers in that tournament, it didn't matter because their laners were so hard winning that better junglers were not able to do anything versus them. The only really interesting jungle matchup that we got in the last tournament was actually Zanzara versus Tinks. Especially in the last game, where Zanzara was legit 1 HP away from just completely destroying Tinks. Jarvan versus Graves. But when it gets to that stage, like, you have to look at who has the better laners. Stuff like Kire becomes irrelevant. Obsess becomes irrelevant. It becomes about, do we really think Ronaldo won't get rolled over by leader? Do we think Tolkien will be able to stand up to Aggressivo at all? Do we think anyone will challenge Segenda at all in this tournament? Probably not. So then, given that, what about mid lane then? Well, then we look at mid lane, and their mid laner, Shekolad, is actually obscenely good. I thought he looked like he was the only guy last split who I gave MVP to in a game that he lost during the tournament. He was the only guy because he was just so hard 1v9ing that game. What about Woolite Trimby then? Well, maybe that's where they could start dropping to say Mouse Sports, but then they have 2 winning lanes and 1 losing. Well, then is that enough for Obsess? Maybe that's enough to disguise the Obsess issue. But that could also go either way. Rogue v Mouse Sports. So we're like, a Rogue then look really like Rogue and Mouse Sports then look like they can compete with each other heavily to me. Can Mouse Sports in a similar regard? Maybe. Can I do that with any other team in this tournament? No. Then it becomes like Bando v Segenda is just so one-sided, it's not even worth talking about, right? Like, this kind of stuff starts happening, which is why I kind of go towards those 3 teams specifically.
Just maybe one more thing to touch on then before we finish up is just the kind of general meta that we're likely to see for the tournament. Because one thing with EU Masters Spring, I wasn't a fan of the meta too much. Like, it was like Trundle every game, and it was like Trundle and then Azir Corki, and it was, I don't know, it was like boring. Like, because you kind of got the thing a lot of the time where the observers can like pretty much ignore top lane because half the time nothing's really going to be happening. But then we had the point where it was even the same mid lane, just Azir Corki, nothing was going to happen. It's like half, 3/4 of the map they couldn't even look at because, yeah, like not much would be going on. So I, for one, would be very happy if it does veer more into Assassins mid at least and see a bit more going on there. And I think the top lane meta has been pretty decent as well, like champions that can actually kill each other. Good. So, yeah, what do you make of the meta? What do you see being the strongest over EU Masters?
I see a meta where the individual talent on Mouse Sports could actually do pretty well. So bot lane is still heavily on range, but it's heavily on range in a very damage focused way, because now we have like full AD Caitlyn, for example, on bot lane, and then to respond to that, you're going to have to go something like Jinx or something like Ashe or stuff like this. Really heavy team fight based champions, so a lot of the utility and a lot of the team fighting is being shifted down towards like the bot side, right? But you'll have assassins and split pushers on top and mid. So with that range on bot side, you're actually looking more into like 1-3-1 compositions, right? Whereas last tournament, it was all about tank top into Ugg smash everywhere. So yeah, I think the meta for this tournament is going to be a lot more exciting and a lot better for rookies, because you want to be able to see an environment where individual talent can display itself. And if everyone is 1-3-1ing, you're going to see a lot more isolated skirmishes or isolated one-on-ones that will allow these players to not just look good, but look obviously good, right? And it has to be obvious for the viewer to actually ascertain if they are good or not. Most viewers don't really understand what is like good jungle pathing or good macro or good any of this stuff, but they understand if you want a one-on-one, right? Like, they understand that. So you'll have a lot more scenarios like that, and it'll probably be a lot more exciting to watch.
Sounds good. Right then, with that, I think we can finish up with this episode. So thanks for coming on. Been good to have you on.
No problem.
Yeah, good, really insightful episode, I think. And for anyone that's still watching on Twitch, has been watching it live, you can follow on there as well for any future episodes. Otherwise, if you're listening back later on either YouTube or Spotify, you can follow there too. And for anyone that is watching, on any platform, you can see our Twitters on the screen as well. So do feel free to drop us all a follow. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.